Welcome to the Primary Sources and Teaching Online webinar series, brought to you by the TPS Western Region at the Metropolitan State University of Denver in partnership with the TPS Teachers Network. I'm Keith Patterson, Associate Director of the TPS Western Region, and I will be your host tonight. Kyle Claybaugh and Crystal Payne will be helping in the chat. Please reach out to them if you have any questions or comments. For those who would like a professional development certificate for your participation, we will provide a link at the end to fill out a brief reflection and where to send the certificate. Our two-part program tonight is entitled Photography and Primary Sources, and it will be presented by the TPS Western Region Executive Director, Peggy O'Neill Jones, along with the two Geeky teachers, Laura Israelsen and Michelle Pearson. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Peggy, Laura, and Michelle.
Well, thank you.
Hi.
Hello, we're glad to be with you guys.
I get these slides moving.
Right.
Okay, there we go. There we go. So I'm Peggy O'Neill Jones, and as Keith mentioned, I am the the Executive Director for the Teaching with Primary Sources Western Region. And one of the things that we were going to talk about today, in my first life, before this, I was a photojournalist. And then I moved into education and became the family photographer. And so the joke in my family is, wait, just one more. That's what they call me. So I used to walk around with tons of equipment, but your students are walking around with an intuitive sense of photography in their head and a very powerful camera in their pocket. So one of the things that we thought is that since they have so much media, they know a lot about photography, whether they know it or not, and they have that camera in their pocket, let's use that to promote learning. So today, this is how the format will go. I am going to go through some of my photographs and go through the visual process and what I think is some of the visual language of photography. And then Michelle and Laura will talk about how some of that might apply in a K-12 classroom. So the idea today is to use photography to enter and complete the inquiry cycle through rephotography, to use photography to develop and write a story, and then examine photographic devices and connect those to other disciplines such as art and writing. So before we get underway, we have that chat there, and if there's any questions or thoughts, I'll check with Keith occasionally throughout the presentation, and I would love to hear about it, either if you have a question or if you have an idea how you might use this. Okay, so the first thing that I'll talk about, photography and primary sources. So the idea, the power of primary sources is to engage students, to help them develop critical thinking skills and to construct knowledge. So one of the ways that I did some of this was to do a rephotography exercise. So I took some primary sources, and then on the left is obviously the primary source. And then on the right is my recreation of that source. But one of the things also is that when you or a student go to the trouble of examining that piece, looking at the lighting, looking at how the person is situated, and trying to recreate that, then it is, when we talk about the inquiry cycle, it is a way to begin to connect or draw you into what that artist or photographer or whoever was trying to do. The other thing too is George Biddle, he was a friend of Franklin Roosevelt, and he was influential in establishing the Federal Art Project. So you can imagine where students might go with something like that. Carl Van Vechten, the same thing, that he was a writer and photographer. He was also a big patron of the Harlem Renaissance. And so you have this style. And Michelle did this activity with her kids, and she's going to talk a little bit more about where they went with this. James Van Der Zee. So the photography on the right is my photography, and the one on the left is a primary source. And Van Der Zee was an African-American, one of the first African-American photographers. So his work included portraits from the Harlem Renaissance, but also he wanted to capture the culture of the Black culture. And then Arnold Guthrie his photography, if you go in the Library of Congress, there's a lot on photographing the San Francisco Chinatown during the turn of the century. And a lot of the 1906 San Francisco earthquakes are gantries. So, you know, again, when you look at that, you're trying to do the rephotography and trying to recreate that, the position, the lighting, all that it takes to put that together. And then this one was actually taken by a photographer, Frances Benjamin Johnson. She was one of the first women photographers, and her first camera was a gift from a family friend called George Eastman Kodak, George Eastman. So she got the photography bug. But the other thing, when you think about, so what could students do with this? Yes, they recreate it from an artistic or photographic perspective. But Helen Hay, she was the daughter of John Milton Hay, the private secretary to Abraham Lincoln. Ways to investigate, things to do. So I think that the idea that I think about behind this rephotography is that there's the art and the photography side of recreating a piece of art or recreating photography. But then in recreating that primary source, then you're into it. So who was Helen Hay? Who was John Milton Hay? Who was Frances Benjamin Johnson? Ferris, S.J. Ferris. So he was he etched, so this is a portrait of him, but he also had one of the biggest collections of arts and images and etching around that time. So he donated that collection. So part of his was his contribution to the etching technology, but the other part was collecting these images, which were later donated. And then Al Hirschfeld. And so they're not all photographers. Ferris was a etcher and Hirschfeld is a artist. And his big thing was to draw theater around the 1920s, 1930s. And so a lot of theater is represented through Hirschfeld's artwork. Okay, so that is an idea about rephotography. Are there any questions before we move into the teaching ideas? Anything in the chat, Keith?
Sorry, no, nothing yet. Just a lot of welcoming back with everybody.
Great. Well, then, Michelle and Laura, you can take over the teaching ideas and just let me know when you want me to change the slide.
Not a problem. So I'll start right here. We were lucky enough to have Peggy actually come into the classroom and work with our students and take this activity with the thought process around photography, but also connect it to other things we were doing. At this time, our language arts department was studying a variety of different periods, including the Civil Rights era, the Harlem Renaissance era, the Holocaust, several other thematic studies. And so we actually tied this to James Van Der Zee and a wonderful exemplary picture book that has been used across a lot of different content curriculum areas and a lot of grade levels to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. It has very rich primary sources in it, as well as a wonderful story about James Van Der Zee. And so we had the students read the story. Peggy came and actually talked and walked through this presentation and talked about elements of photography, what it meant to be a photographer, what it meant to use the different elements, which we'll be talking about later in the presentation, in creating a good photo. And we had students brainstorm as a group or some ideas around this, what photos meant to them when they were looking and analyzing a primary source. And then they read the biography about James Van Der Zee that was outside of the book. So we read the book, we saw the biography, we had a scholar presentation with this. And then we allowed the students to review the presentation and we gave them an assignment. Peggy, do you want to click to the next slide? So then we gave them an assignment to actually recreate a photo, just as Peggy did in her work. And it was amazing what came out of this. Our students looked at it really with two different lenses. They looked at it both with the photographic lens, but also with the lens of what it meant to them, why they took the photo, how it represented them, their family, or their community. So if you look at the picture on the left, you can see that Shaylin chose Leonardo da Vinci's piece. And you can see that she talked about the lighting. And it's interesting because she said, I thought the lighting was easy to mimic and the angle wasn't perfect. She took this picture 15 or 20 different times to get it to what she wanted, or the closest piece. And she talks about that in a reflective journal that she did, talking about the process of being the photographer. You can see on the right that Alea was a little bit different. She actually researched a photographer and saw his picture and then chose it because it was meaningful to her and her sister, and then recreated the image. Peggy, can you go on to the next one? Because here, I'd really like to take a look and take a live look at what happened. After the students went to this, they created a series of pictures. They researched a photographer and had to mimic or recreate something. Peggy, why don't you choose one? It doesn't matter which one, 1, 2, or 3, and could you click one of those links? It's gonna take us out into the field.
So this is 3, period 3.
That's fine.
Is that
So
okay?
you can see some of the mimics here. They did a drawing piece. You can see that a couple of them chose the same photographer. And actually, Riley actually chose one like Peggy had down on the right corner. And you can see how they posted. We used Padlet as a way to do this. You can also use a shared Google Drive. There's lots of different things you can do. But this was really nice so that the kids could see all the different pieces. You'll notice, look at Olivia's up in the left. It's up at the top. You'll see 2 cars. She actually took a VW bus and went outside and found a Matchbox car and recreated the picture that way too. So Peggy, can you go back really quick and maybe choose a different one, 1 or 2? Could you look at that?
Here's 2.
There we go. There's 2. So you can see some of the other images that the students chose in here. They vary from a single portrait to a floral image, to an image of an animal, things that connected to them in some way. They either dressed a certain way, they set up the photograph a certain way, they may have just done the stance. But what was really lovely about it is they really dove in and had to think through the process of photography and then think about the research they had done in learning about the photographer, and then they applied that. So there you go. Peggy, you want to go on to the next slide?
Sure.
All right. So I tripped across
Michelle,
something.
it just
Go ahead.
reminded me, just very quickly, one thing when
Go
you're
ahead.
talking about Da Vinci, there is a lighting style in photography called Rembrandt Lighting, and because Rembrandt used it in all of his paintings. So
Okay.
I won't go deeper into that, but Rembrandt Lighting, which is very well known in photography, is because when you look, Rembrandt's paintings are full. He did it. He started it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, and you know, the kids all came away. It's amazing. They still talk about this, and I think it gave them a different perspective as well. One of the side assignments that is linked in the presentation, and I gave you all the links in the presentation so you could see the assignment, use that. One of them was to photograph a day in the life of a 7th grader, and they actually applied those photographic techniques to what they were doing with the lighting and the setting and all those things, and so we'll continue to talk about that. I want to really quickly, though, talk about this. I was listening to 99% Invisible podcast, if you know 99% Invisible. If not, take a look. It's wonderful. And we were actually listening to Ken Burns. And Ken Burns made a comment in the podcast, and I had to rewind it twice to get it right. But it really stuck with me, especially in this. He says that through images, we bring life to the dead. And when I first heard that, I thought, ooh, that's creepy. But then he talks about how it's really a magical process, and about through a good photographer's eye and selecting these wonderful images, we can really bring to light and illuminate the stories that are hidden, and also the past and the present. And so that is where I want to launch you into the next section of our presentation so we can move forward. Peggy, go ahead. Laura, you want to take it?
Sure. So we took rephotography to another level with our students. And in the image on the left, you will see that a student is holding a piece of paper, and it's a picture, a primary source picture from, it's actually from the Denver Historic Archives of what that area looked like around the turn of the century in the 1900s. And so when we were out on the field trip, they had this picture with them, and they were able to go down and kind of line it up and take that picture, comparing how it looks today to how it looked at that time. And there's a little, one of the links will take you out to the image of the Denver Capitol that's on the Library of Congress. We had several different options for the students. And so they had to study this out, but think of the application for that as you are on field trips or taking students out of your classroom, or as they're leaving their classroom and going places, that whole rephotography idea and what to do with that. So on the other side, on the right side, I have a little quote from Keith. Keith did an interview with using rephotography, but look at this image down at the bottom right. This is on the campus at Metro, and I'm going to have you, Peggy, if you would click on that MSU Denver Then and Now link. So I also put the tool there that you can use to have students make this kind of a juxtapose image. But if you, so here, isn't that beautiful? Like there's the street today and, you know, all the clothes from yesteryear. But if you scroll down a little bit, Peggy, there's some information there and kind of a fun article about rephotography, but if you keep going, so right there. So here's the juxtaposition with the tool. So if you'll kind of grab that in the middle and slide that back and forth, so then you can see the whole picture on both sides and how that was lined up with a primary source and with a picture from today. And Night Lab just came out with this tool, and they help kids line that up pretty well. Go down a little bit more. So there's some great images here of Denver, downtown. Here's the library in 1972 when it was being built, and then how it looks today. If you go down a little bit more. I love this one. So, right? Isn't that beautiful how it, so to line that up, but to have students go out with their own primary source or to use this tool, and then I'm going to have you go down one more. I think that's the one out on the, yes, look how fun this is. So 1972, I stood there, believe it or not, last summer, and it's just so amazing. So here we are in 2019, almost the exact same, right? It just looks, didn't change.
The clothes are different, yeah.
Different in its color. Yeah, isn't that amazing though? And there's some better picnic tables, but the trees got bigger. Yeah, but really interesting. And then there's some more beautiful buildings on the Auraria campus, and the Golda Meir house is also just below that too. So just to be able to go in and do the research, have the students really examine change over time and see, you know, what happened in the past. Look how we have helped to preserve Golda Meir's home. You know, sometimes it looks better in the present too. So a really interesting assignment for students, and I think a powerful way for them to study history and primary sources, and also to relate it to their life now. So put those primary sources in your pocket, and remember that they're snapshots of something that happened, right?
And that leads right into what Peggy's going to talk about with the story, right?
Right. Well, part of it too is using photography to capture a story so that you can write about it. So the first week in March of 2020, I was in Israel when all of the pandemic began to get big. And so you think about photography, that it also has, everything has an author, whether it's writing or whether it's a photographer, but everything has an author and everyone has an audience. So in the beginning, of course, I was doing the touristy shots, with me behind a rock, in front of a big rock and things like this. But when history transformed before my eyes and I saw it, I said, oh my goodness, I've got to capture this. And so this is what it looked like. This was the Church of the Nazarene, hope I say that right. But people in their cell phones and in the Jerusalem market, which you can imagine a Middle East market. You can imagine the noise and everybody elbow to elbow and yelling and bartering for this and that. It was dead quiet, and the merchants are sitting there like, now what? And everybody on their cell phones saying, so what's happening here? Yeah. And again, another one with just the eerie quietness of it all. So what I'm saying is I transitioned from being the author of my touristy little photos to the author of a historical event happening in front of me. And this is on Temple Mount. And again, normally it's packed with people, and the isolation and the solitude, it was stunning, just stunning to see it. Oops. And then what I did then with having the images was then to come back and write about it and write what I saw and the experience. But having those images taking those images as I saw it happen gave me the ability to go back and then put those words together rather than trying to remember. So the idea too is that sometimes you go out looking for a story with photography, and then sometimes history and stories just show up in front of you. So teaching ideas.
Ah, you get me again. So if you would click on that documenting the now. So Paul Salopek, he is a journalist, and he says that we have lost the power of slow journalism. So in 2013, he set out on foot, and he is crossing he's actually walking around the world, but you can follow his path. And this has just been fascinating, a fascinating resource to follow. If you go back to the presentation and click on, so if you can see his map, I have just loved this whole thing. But you can see where he started, and he calls it Out of Eden. So they started there because those were where they found traces of the oldest man. And then he's been walking around, and you can, and then he'll end up down at the bottom of South America. But he has, I'll come back to that one. So let's go to the milestone. So if you'll click on that, every 100 miles, he stops and does the same thing with his photography and the way he's telling a story. So you can see his map, and you can see his milestones. If you'll scroll down a little bit, I'm looking for, it's not really coming up. Go ahead and click on Walking Grass. I was looking for milestone 18, but we'll come back to it. So he has a couple of different things and he does like Peggy did in this in her blog. So he'll take a picture and he blogs about it, and he just writes beautifully, but he talks about everything that's going on. He'll take a little video, and then people comment on his story. If you go back to the presentation, and click on the example. So every 100 miles, he stops and he takes pictures of, he calls them milestones. So he marks it like this. So this is day 366. He'll mark the mile at 1,700 miles from when he started. And this is the elevation. And that's some interesting elevation, right? And then he will add a little bit of some text. The tents of the tomato pickers look like white mushrooms in the fields. I mean, this is text that you can just, you know, take a bath in almost. I mean, he's just a really good writer, and to expose kids to this. And now go down and hit start. So this is one thing that he does. You'll notice this little toolbar along the bottom. So the first thing, every 100 miles, he takes a panoramic picture. And if you go up, Peggy, and hit that drag, you can drag around, and he actually posts this. So you get a sense of what it is to just stand there and look all the way around where he's at. Then the next point at the bottom, yeah, right? Yes, exactly. He'll geolocate. Yep, so click on that, and he'll tell you where he's at, where this is at in along the journey. And he's always a little bit behind, like he doesn't really, you can't figure out where he is exactly, but at mile marker 18, when he was there at about 1,800 miles, this was where he was in Jordan. And then if you go to the next one, he takes a picture of his feet and he takes a picture of the sky. And sometimes his feet are in water, sometimes his feet are in sand. It's really fascinating. And then the next one, he talks to the first person that he sees. He asks them the same 3 questions. Who are you? Where do you come from? Where are you going? And some of them are very sad to read, right? Like this one. And then he does something that he calls a glance. And if you will just click on that, it's, and this is about a minute. I'm gonna have you play a little bit of it. It's usually 30 seconds to a minute. He'll tell you exactly where he's at.
It may not have audio with it.
It does have audio. So yeah, if you go in there, you'll be able to hear what it's like to be right there. So it's kind of that primary source of he's not doing a lot to interpret this. He's just saying this is where it's at. And then the spotlight, which this is kind of interesting. He calls it a spotlight, but he will check if he can access social media in that area. He'll check and see what's popular, what's posting right there. So that's what he calls that. All right, if you'll go back to the presentation. So National Geographic and Harvard partnered with Paul Salopek, and they created a class, and it's this Out of Eden class, and I joined this with my students. And you can go in, you can choose to join the class, or you can just access the curriculum and the activities. But my kids love saying, I'm taking a class at Harvard, right? And it would partner them up, and they were able to see some things that were going on with kids around the world. One of the first assignments that they had was to draw maps of their neighborhood. And so you can imagine how different the neighborhoods looked when they started comparing them to other students from around the world. They had to go around and take pictures of front doors in their neighborhood and then discuss that with other students. And then every once in a while, Paul Salopek will send your class a postcard as well and tell them what he's doing from where he's at. So it's fascinating. Harvard graduate students run this with National Geographic, and I just have found it to be a great cross-curricular resource in terms of writing, photography, history, really telling your own story, all of those things. So hopefully that will kind of help you. But
Yeah,
you love Paul Salopek now.
Okay, well, I think we are at our first 30 minutes. We're going to take a very short break and come back for more on photography. But first, a word from our sponsors, the Library of Congress. So Keith, you want to?
Or just me. Yeah, well, thanks, Peggy. Just as a reminder, we just wanted to let you know that those professional development certificates are available for your participation. You just need to follow that link there, the bit.ly/PS teaching online, all lowercase. Fill out a brief reflection and just let us know where you want to send that. And we will get that out to you as soon as we can.